Welcome to Asia House. My name is Anna Temby and I am the Literature Programme Manager here. This event is part of the Asia House Bagri Foundation Literature Festival, which is running until the 6th of November. Please do take a look at our upcoming events on asiahousearts.org or pick up a printed programme in reception. If you'd like to tweet tonight, we're at Asia House Arts, or on Instagram, we're at Asia House UK. Our hashtag is Asia Lit Fest. We're delighted to have Elif Shafak and Nus Ghani with us tonight. There will be a chance for you to ask questions at the end of the conversation, and Elif will also be signing books. Our bar will also reopen again until 9 p.m. Before I hand over the microphone, please allow me to say a few words about our moderator this evening, Nus Ghani. Nus Ghani is the Conservative MP for Wealden in East Sussex. She was elected with 32,508 votes with a majority of 57%, the highest vote share for any candidate in the constituency's history. In Parliament, Nusrat has sat on the Home Affairs Select Committee, the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and served as the Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Home Office. As of January 2018, Nusrat is now a government whip and a minister at the Department for Transport, where her brief covers maritime, buses, taxis, high-speed rail, and skills and apprenticeships. A few days after joining the Department for Transport, Nusrat made history as the country's first female Muslim minister to speak at the dispatch box at Parliament. I'm sure Elif Shafak needs no introduction, but I will now hand over the microphone to Nusrat to introduce our speaker for this evening. So please join me in giving a really warm welcome to Elif Shafak and Nus Ghani. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are in for a treat this evening. We have Elif with us, and she requires no introduction. An award-winning author, feminist, political activist, and most importantly, the best weaver of stories. Elif, I love reading your books because you have a rhythm to your writing. Not only do you draw me into your stories, but at the same time, you are gently challenging me, my ideas on culture, identity, masculinity, femininity, power, and love. Elif, you recently wrote an article and you said that we, the public, should listen to novelists as well as politicians, so hopefully we'll be doing that this evening. You spoke about one of your early experiences, and I think many people in this room will be able to reflect on your early experience. You spoke about the importance of the Quran in your family home. You were raised by your mother and your grandmother. You mentioned that your mother was very rational. Your grandmother was very passionate, emotional, and spiritual. And in one home, the Quran was easily accessible. It was on a coffee table. It wasn't to be feared. It was something to flick through and see how it reflected on your day-to-day life. But in another home, the Quran was wrapped in a cloth and kept quite high on a shelf. It was something to be feared. It laid down the rules that was to govern your life and my life as Muslim women, but both you and I have broken those rules. So how did that experience enable you to become a writer today?
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure for me, to share this stage. I have a lot of respect for your work, and I find your voice in the public space so important, increasingly more important, I have to say, in this world. So it's really a pleasure for me. Yes, I did grow up maybe in a fragmented house, or not in a, maybe I should put it this way, not in a typical patriarchal, continuous Turkish household. There were lots of ruptures, and it was a broken family in many ways. My parents got separated. I was born in France. Afterwards, I came with my mom to Ankara, and we came to this from this very leftist student environment in Strasbourg in France. I was zoomed to Ankara, to a very middle-class, very conservative, Muslim majority neighborhood, which was my maternal grandma's environment. And she's the woman who raised me. But there was a time when I was also going back and forth between my paternal grandma and my maternal grandma. And the reason why maybe this story stayed with me so vividly is because at the first glance, these two women are both Turkish, both are Sunni, Hanefi, same middle class, same culture, same language, same customs, and yet they couldn't have been more different. In their worldview, in the way they interpreted religion, in the way they interpreted the Quran. And that was very striking to me. In one house, in my paternal grandma's house, it was up on the wall, beautifully encased, but you were not supposed to touch it, let alone ask any questions. And also as a woman, you realize there's a big gap. And then in my maternal grandmother's house, it wasn't like that. It was next to the book of Farhad and Shirin, Leyla and Mejnun. It was the holy book, but it was accessible. You could flip through, you could ask questions. Whether you're a girl or a boy, man or woman, doesn't matter. To me, that was incredibly important. That it wasn't based on fear. My paternal grandma's interpretation was always based on fear, and God was a celestial gaze, never blinking. And I remember coming back from her house in Izmir, slightly traumatized, unable to go to the bathroom because you don't want to be seen, because God is always watching. Even everything you think, what passes across your mind is being judged constantly. And that's quite stressing, it's stressful. Whereas when I ask the same questions to my maternal grandma, she would say, oh, I'm sure God has more important things than watching you in the bathroom, So there was humor, she would take it lightly, she could make fun of things. It wasn't as rigid, and those things stayed with me.
So the power of thought is very important.
Right.
You talk about the lack of diversity now, in not only in the political sphere, but also in the newspapers and also in novel writing too. And you talk about the importance of diversity, especially when you're representing what some would consider a minority perspective.
Yes.
And if I reflect on some of your books and the power of language, The Bastard of Istanbul, you wrote some stories, but they challenged the powers that be, and your freedom was potentially at threat. The 40 Rules of Love, Three Daughters of Eve, Flea Palace, and Honor, about relationships, love and power, and also Black Milk, which reflects also on your own issues around mental health.
Right.
How did those experiences enable you to become a stronger and stronger writer when you're entering a field where people were trying to silence your voice?
Yes. I think in a country like Turkey, it is very hard, particularly for younger women. Gender is a big criteria, unfortunately, big source of discrimination, but also so is age. And for younger women, it's very tough. Especially if you're a journalist, an academic, a writer, no matter what you write, what you produce, you're primarily a woman in their eyes. And they will put you down, they will belittle you, they will ridicule you. I've read so many reviews. One of them stayed with me so vividly. The critic started his piece by saying, let's see what our daughter has written this time. I had just published another novel. And the person who's calling me our daughter, as if I'm the daughter of a nation, is my age. But the fact that he's a man, he just situates himself above me. So you go through lots of things. The literary world, at the first glance, could be it looks very liberal, it looks very democratic on the surface. It's westernized, it's very modern. But when you scratch the surface, underneath, it's the same patriarchy, it's the same sexism, it's the same homophobia that you see elsewhere in the society. It's not different at all. That's why I think for women, it becomes slightly easier as they age. And that is why women in the Middle East, in different fields, we just can't wait to get old. We're trying to get old as fast as we can, just taking big leaps, because then you're slightly more respected, and which is something we need to challenge. The thing that makes me sad is patriarchy is like a chain, Many women, they think, I have gone through this, now it's her turn. So they do what has been done to them, they do it to younger women. I see this in traditional settings, I see this in non-traditional settings, but we have to break that chain.
There was a lot of laughter when you talked about age, but my experience is the same as yours. My mother and my aunts always added 10 years on top of what their ages were meant to be, because more age meant that you had more respect, more dignity, and more power. And I consider myself to be quite mature in the real world, but in the world of politics, I'm quite young, because everyone else, the men, are considerably older. But you've mentioned something there that also happens in politics, that a modern country, a democratic country, anyone can stand for office, but there is this old school mentality about who should have power
Yeah.
and who has the right to voice their opinions.
Yeah.
You've spoken about identity politics and how you try and challenge that in your novels, and you're concerned that the space to be individual is shrinking. Do you want to reflect on that a bit?
Yes, and what you said, I find it so important because there are all these unspoken rules. They're unwritten. Had they been written somewhere, we could just take it and show it to people and say, you know, this is what we're trying to challenge. But because it's so diffused, and patriarchy often is, but so are cultural biases, lots of different types of discrimination work on that very subtle level in our daily lives, and it's much more difficult to challenge that, also because people internalize those values, sometimes without questioning. And those are the things that I think a writer, a storyteller should try to bring to the fore. For me, it's always has been important. When I look at my books, each and every one of them has been different. And this is not something that I planned over the years. It's because my curiosity took me, in that direction. And I think I changed with each book. Books change us. They change their readers, but they also change their writers. You're a different person by the time it finishes. But there are some underlying themes that I notice in maybe all of them. And one maybe current continuous theme is this desire to give more voice to people who have been either voiceless or forgotten, or whose stories have been silenced. I've always been interested in the other. Maybe also because I have felt like that growing up, always in the very edge of the society. Somehow you're tolerated but not fully accepted, and you're very much aware of that thin line. You can easily cross that boundary. I observed that a lot, maybe through my mother, through that broken family relationship, being an outsider. Also maybe through my own relationship with my father, because I grew up without seeing him. He was a very good father to his sons, but completely different person with me. So you start questioning, you feel like the other in many different ways. And in my books, I think there's always an attempt, an effort to give more voice to minorities, sexual minorities, cultural minorities, political minorities, just to try to tell the story through their eyes. In that regard, I think a novelist should not try to give answers. Actually, I don't like it when writers try to preach or teach or write with a mission. But I think it's a writer's job to ask the questions, just to say, why can't we talk about this? And therefore, it's my job to question taboos as well, and then leave the answers always to the readers.
If you are trying to tackle taboos and you see yourself as the other, one way that you have been, there are attempts to undermine you, is to point out that you aren't Turkish enough. You're not close enough to this culture. You're not close enough to the pain that they feel. But this is a typical ruse that those in power can use when they don't have the language themselves to reflect the concerns in those communities. How have you been able to manage with that?
Yeah, I have been accused so many times of not being Turkish enough, or I've been accused of insulting Turkishness, even though nobody knows what that means. And we have a law, actually, to guarantee that nobody insults Turkishness, Article 301 in our constitution. Anytime you question history, official historiography, the official narrative, you can easily be labeled as the traitor, as a betrayer. I read so many articles written about me, in which they accuse me of stabbing the nation in the back, siding with Armenians, with Jews, with Greeks, whoever is the other for them. And I think it's not a coincidence that they speak like that. If you write in English, they think you're not Turkish enough. If you have lived in different countries, they think you're not Turkish enough. By the way, if you have multi-ethnic parents, let's say, you're not Turkish enough. There's no end to that. And to me, that's ridiculous, because this is a country where I'm talking about Turkey that was once upon a time a multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-religious empire. We are all a combination, all of us. In our families, we have combination of cultures, ethnicities. But there's this imaginary, it's an illusion, the illusion of nationalism, of homogeneous nationalism. It's just a myth, but people want to believe that myth. I really hope one day those tests in which you can see your genealogy can be free or compulsory, so that people can see that there's no such thing as pure Turk or pure German or pure Hungarian. That is a lie. We are all a mixture, and we should celebrate that.
But then the issue that you have is that people's experiences differ. And unfortunately, the space that you and I are trying to step into, we're being told constantly that there can only be one experience and one voice and one campaign. Yeah. And I have also come across this in my own experience, only being a member of Parliament for a few years, picking up campaigns that were previously managed by a particular group of people. But if you're not in their reflection, or if you're not campaigning with them, if you want to step outside and do something differently, it challenges them. And instead of trying to have a conversation with you, they feel that they have to undermine you. And you spoke about being different and being a woman, and the threat of being undermined if you're trying to enter that political sphere. Do you think you will continue dipping your toe in, or does it make you feel you want to step back?
I think I have two very opposite energies. As a writer, what we do is based on solitude. The novel requires solitude, and when you're writing, you go back into that imaginary cocoon. You stay in that world as long as you can. But then when the book is over, I give public talks, I enjoy this, I enjoy doing events, so completely different energies. But I think there's a part of me, whether I'm in this energy field or the second energy field, there's a part of me that always wants to question identity politics. And this idea that we have monolithic, stable, static identities is just so against my nature. I'd rather have multiple belongings. So I like to think of myself, of course I'm an Istanbulite, I'm very attached to Istanbul, but I'm also attached to the Aegean, to the Balkans, the Middle East. There's so many elements in my soul that I bring from the Middle East. And I'm also a European by birth. The values that I share, that I uphold. Over the years, I have become a Londoner. So all of those things, and why not a world citizen? And why not a global soul? Can I not be multiple things at the same time? Do I have to pick just one thing? It worries me. I lived in Boston for a while, and it left a big impact on me. African American women's movement and the legacy of the movement of 1970s. It changed me a lot. Because many of those women, they knew what racism was, they were black. They knew what sexual discrimination was, they were women. Many of them came from LGBT communities, they knew how homophobia worked and many other kinds of sexual discrimination. And they also came from disempowered family backgrounds, they knew how class distinction worked. So when you look at their writings, people like Audre Lorde, but also James Baldwin from a different background, they always say this, you know, I am multiple. And I'm a woman, I'm this, I'm that, I'm a mother, I'm a poet, and I'm many more things you might not be able to see at first glance. I contain those multitudes inside. Whereas I look at the leftist or liberal movements today, and I'm worried that we're losing that emphasis on multiplicity in the name of identity politics, in the name of retreating into one single tribe. I do not want to be reduced to a single tribe.
But do you think identity politics has taken hold on having that single identity because people are being forced into understanding the one version of victimhood? So if they were to have multiple identities, they wouldn't be able to have the power of saying, I've become a victim here, my voice has not been heard, so this can be the only way that I can challenge the way that my voice is being reflected and I can change my circumstances. It's about controlling people once again.
Yes, I understand, but why singular narratives? You know, these clashing. I think what bothers me is this need for certainties, clashing certainties, and this is happening a lot actually on university campuses, on both sides of the Atlantic. I've been to so many talks when you have an atheist speaker situated against a theist speaker, and they're expected to clash. And actually, it's a very boring conversation because when you listen to these talks, it's very repetitive. You know, the same things are said over and over because everybody's trying to get more votes from the audience. It is not a proper intellectual exchange. In my opinion, a proper intellectual exchange means I have my opinions. I thought about these things, but I'm also ready to listen to you. And if anything you say, you know, challenges me, I am ready to change. It's a more liquid exchange. I don't see that. It's just clashing certainties. I always want to see, is there a third approach or a fifth approach? You know, where's the sixth speaker on that panel? Where's the seventh approach? We don't allow ourselves that kind of nuanced way of thinking, and the media and the culture and the populist movements that we are being subjected to today are constantly asking us to choose one side once and for all. I think we need to be very careful about this.
Maybe we were lucky and we grew up in a period where you could have more than one identity and accept that you could embrace more than one culture. And unfortunately, for young people now, they are being forced to identify who they are quite early on. Yeah. We spoke about universities prior to this and the issue of safe spaces. When I was on the Home Affairs Select Committee, we had a number of university heads come and visit us who were concerned that they couldn't invite a number of speakers in. But when we asked them what sort of speakers they were always the same sort of speakers. They wouldn't bring anyone that we would consider that would be truly challenging to the audience. For example, Ayan Hirsi Ali, or someone that has given up their faith, or someone that was quite strong in their faith and was also then LGBT, for example. But they wanted to bring people in that would constantly be the most topical storyteller of the day, but they weren't really challenging to the students. So my concern is that as students, our young people, when they're at university, should be expanding their mind the most, are being encouraged to narrow their thoughts.
I tried to tackle a little bit in Three Daughters of EU when I told the story of three women, young women, all of them attending the same university, but they come from different backgrounds, but they're all Muslim in a different way, or they all come from Muslim backgrounds, sorry. And the reason why I wanted to deal with that is because I've seen this in Turkey so many times, where politics is so aggressive, so divisive. It also divides women badly, and young people badly. And I think when women are divided, the only thing that benefits from this is patriarchy itself. You know, we might have different political opinions, we might have different ideological opinions, but don't we have anything in common? I mean, in a country where you see, again, I'm talking about Turkey, a huge escalation in gender violence, sexual harassment on the streets. There are some legislators who are trying to pass laws that allow rapists to walk scot-free if they marry their victims. In a country where all of this is happening, I think women should be able to get together, you know, should be able to unite in the public space around core issues, common issues, and yet we can't, because of politics, because of those ideological divisions. So it troubles me, and that's why maybe there's a part of me that wants to ask, can there be sisterhood? Can there be some kind of solidarity among women with different worldviews? My grandma, my mother, completely different worldviews. And yet, thanks to the solidarity between these two women, not only my mother's life changed, but also mine and my own children's. So I think the impact of these networks of sisterhood can be very, very long-lasting, but we need to go beyond day-to-day politics for that to happen.
On a more positive note, we do work across the House on issues that we are passionate about. So I work quite closely with MPs from other side of the House on women's rights, women's empowerment, or just ensuring that we give a voice to women. And when we're in environments that we're encouraging young girls to enter politics, that we do it in a collegiate way. But the space that we can do that is becoming smaller. We had an event a few weeks ago, which was an event for writers, speakers, politicians to come and talk about political ideas. But a number of speakers who wanted to come and attend from the Labour Party were unable to come and attend. So it just makes it more and more difficult to work as a team when you're passionate about dealing with an issue, when tribal politics gets in the way, and that's probably the last thing you expected here in the UK.
I mean, every part of the world is changing, sadly, and sometimes I'm worried that countries like Turkey can be a blueprint for the loss of democracy or the loss of nuances in public space in other parts of the world. But I also believe that the art of storytelling has maybe a different chemistry, and maybe it doesn't speak, because day-to-day politics relies to a large extent to divisions. Whereas for the writer, there's no other, there's no us, there's no them. And I think particularly for storytellers, it's very important to try to rehumanize anyone who has been dehumanized through this public discourse. To me, that's very important. So if I may share this with you, I mean, in Turkey, I have many readers who are quite xenophobic, you know, and if you ask their opinions about minorities, about Greeks, Armenians, Jews, Kurds, Alevis, they will tell you lots of negative things. And then they come and they say, you know, I read your book, and the person that I loved the most in this book was this person, and maybe that person's a minority member. Equally, I have many homophobic readers, because this is the way they have been raised. And then they come and they say, I related to this character, and maybe that character is transsexual or gay. And I thought about this, you know, how is it possible that people who are more intolerant in the public space, they become relatively, a little bit maybe, more open to connecting with the other when they're alone. I don't think it's a coincidence. Fascism, authoritarianism, totalitarianism, these are all collectivistic diseases. They need synchronized energy. They need the loss of individuality. And I think art very much relies on restoring that individuality to such an extent that you connect with the other and you realize actually the other is me.
Yeah. So that is about the power of reading one of your novels at home or at work or on the tube. But unfortunately, politics is played out in 140 words or characters or less. So we don't have that same space. So my concern is that we don't have the opportunity to tell stories, to have a debate, to win over an argument. So how are we going to get more people either engaged in politics or trying to put forward a third way of doing politics if that space isn't there?
I think more people need to get engaged in politics. To me, if you happen to be a writer from wounded democracies or wobbly countries like Turkey, Nigeria, Egypt, Pakistan, the Philippines, Russia, now the list is so long, you don't have the luxury of being apolitical. But the interesting thing is, maybe after the year 2016, more and more people realize actually none of us has the luxury. No matter where you live, there's no such thing as solid countries versus liquid countries. I have heard many times, with all the good intentions, people coming to me when I used to live in Istanbul and saying, it's very understandable for you to be a feminist because you live in Turkey. You know, as if those people don't have to be a feminist because they live in Canada. They're over that stage. And now that feeling has evaporated. Now people know that time can go backwards. So I think what we need is activism. What we need is the kind of politics that needs to go beyond this two-party politics. I'm sorry, but I think that's no longer feasible. That's no longer the answer. So the kind of politics, not partisan politics, not even party politics, but the kind of political activism that cares about the loss of core values and brings us together, we're going to need more of that in the coming years.
And we're going to need more women.
And more
so
women,
how are we going to get more women engaged in a space that they already feel is quite hostile, is managed by men, or there are power structures they cannot access? How are we going to try and do that?
Yeah, we need to support each other. Not blindly, of course, but that support mechanism is very important. It's a very maybe small example, but I've seen this over and over in Turkey so many times. I published children's books in Turkey, and I would go to different schools and talk to students of very different age groups. So when you walk into a primary school, you chat with young people. It's just amazing to see 7-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old children. So many of them want to become writers, poets, artists, and girls at that age are full of chutzpah. They're just full of courage. They speak more. And the imagination is amazing. And then you go to high schools, everything has changed. You know, everything around the time they're 13 years old, 14 years old. Why? Because we have socialized. They've gone through school, the family, the society, and we've taught these girls to be timid, to worry about what people are going to say. This is a huge pressure on so many young women. You know, how are you going to be judged by the words of other people? And I see this happening in especially settings where patriarchy is much more oppressive. We need to break that. We need to be more supportive of each other. In many fields, I support, maybe some people in the audience will question me on this, but I support in the political system, you know, quotas for women, because again, in countries like Turkey, if you don't have that, there's no way you can change the system. Should you like, we can talk about this. But in a nutshell, I think the support system, the awareness is very important.
I think if we change the way that we raised our boys and girls, we raised our boys to be obedient and abide by the rules, and if we raised our girls to break all the rules, it might change who puts themselves forward for public service. But I have the same experience as yourself. I'm also the Minister for the Year of Engineering, which is to try and get more young girls in particular to take up jobs in engineering. And when I visit them at primary schools, they're at the front of the line, they want to ask questions, want to get engaged. But as soon as I go into a secondary school, they'll never raise their hand to ask a question. It takes a lot of effort to get them involved. They've already decided this space isn't for them. But they're then quite excited that they've met a member of parliament that isn't who they thought it was going to be. I'm not a man, I'm not white, I'm Muslim, and I'm a conservative, so it throws them. But there aren't enough of us to go around to get these young girls in particular motivated to think that you can be whatever you wish to be, and you have more power than you know. And getting them back into reading, especially reading novels, will be one way to do it, but unfortunately our attention spans are very short. I know this because in Parliament you can only give speeches between 3 and 11 minutes. Everybody else falls asleep, so we don't have the luxury of talking for too long. But we're losing that art. The way that we're losing the art to debate, the way we're losing the art to communicate with each other, we're also losing the art of reading.
Yeah, I fully agree, but to me one of the biggest surprises about the UK was to see how libraries are not being supported and libraries are being shut down. To me that's unacceptable. You know, if we want more people to read at the local, regional, national level, we have to invest in libraries. We have to bring books to disempowered, disadvantaged communities, and we have to invest in this. And in that regard, we have to invest in storytelling. Again, just a small example, but I remember it very vividly when I was in high school, reading a novel by Ivo Andrić, and there was this scene, two Balkan citizens are talking about the Ottoman Empire, and they're talking about the Janissary system, which was like the center of the Ottoman military, yeah? And so one of them is singing the praises of the Janissary system, which is the only narrative that I had heard at school, and the other one is questioning it so sharply and bitterly and saying things that I had never heard at school. And it is through a novel that you realize, wait a minute, the same history can be told in 2 different ways. Actually, it can be told in 60 different ways, depending on who's telling the story. A novel tells you that, a novel shows you that. I think we have to invest in stories. If we believe in nuances, if we believe in multiplicity, we have to invest in libraries. There's a lot of work to do for all of us, yeah.
But you go beyond that. You talk about the power of language to break up ghettos, and you challenge us parliamentarians, politicians who don't quite get it right. And you talk about the power of circles, how you can use language to break people's mental ghettos so they have a better perception of who they are and what they can achieve. Do you want to talk about that?
I think we're living in an age in which emotions are becoming more and more important in the field of politics, because emotions guide politics and emotions also misguide politics. So this is the age of anxiety, it's the age of resentment, bitterness, fear, and also anger. Now, on the one hand, it's not a coincidence that this is happening because everything is happening so fast. Imagine, for the majority of history, the majority of people, I'm talking about centuries and centuries, they lived, they worked, they fell in love, and then they died within only miles of their birthplace. They didn't go that far. And now look at our age. I don't need to ask to you how many miles are you away from your own birthplace, either at this stage in your life or before or after. We're moving around a lot. Everything is happening too fast. This is the age of movements. In many ways, it's the age of ambiguity. And people react to ambiguity in different ways. Many people think they will be safer if they retreat into zones based on sameness. And this is what the demagogue is telling us. Many demagogues are selling us this myth that we will be safer if we're surrounded people who look like us, who vote like us, who think like us. And again, that's a myth. You know, they say diversity is dangerous. They say diversity corrupts our culture. And this is going across entire European continent. When you look at the Pew Research, the results, it is quite worrying actually. The number of European citizens who are saying, because of diversity, and they use the word diversity, my country got worse. It used to be a better place in the past. The number of people saying this is increasing across the entire continent, including in this country. And I come from a country that has lost its diversity, that has lost its cosmopolitan heritage, and I think in Turkey, by losing that, we have lost a lot. And I'm not only talking about an economic loss or a political loss, but something in our consciousness also was gone. So I'm very cautious when it comes to this myth of sameness, tribes, nationalism, but I'm also aware of the power of emotions. And I'm sad to see how emotions are being exploited by many politicians, by many demagogues, as we're speaking right now.
To make people feel insecure. By making them feel insecure,
to
they
sell
feel
them
they
a
can control
dream,
them.
to sell them a myth, you know. And I think it's a pity that in political science we usually underestimate the power of emotions. I mean, there's so much research about economy, about the impact of immigration, and these should be there. Of course, they're incredibly important. But what about the role of emotions in politics? It's such an abstract question that we don't research it enough. But when I read people, for instance, again, just to give you an example, the scholars who were not surprised when Trump was elected, when I look at those people who were not surprised at all, because many people were surprised, even experts, right, journalists, these were scholars who, for instance, had been following the Tea Party movement for a while, like Theda Skocpol. And she says in her work, she's been saying this for years, this academic, that the Tea Party movement, that in my opinion, preceded what's happening today, was mostly triggered by emotions rather than economic factors. Of course, economic inequality is incredibly important, but the perception is also important, the anxiety. In a country like Poland, Poland is a relatively less diverse country ethnically, but number one question in national elections in Poland was immigration and immigrants. It wasn't their number one question. Again, perception, how we perceive. Before Brexit, I have seen road signs saying the Turks are coming, 80 million of them. You know, Turkey is going to join EU. Everyone knew that Turkey was not going to join the EU anytime soon. But again, perception, how you trigger emotions and what you do with that. I think we need to be very careful about that.
So maybe the obsession with politics about getting the economics right needs to be balanced out with those that can tell the most powerful story, which can be the simplest story that triggers an emotional reaction from the electorate, because those are very simple stories that people could hook into, those that felt nervous or insecure about the place that they felt was their home.
It's always easier to fear the other if you haven't met a member of the other. You know, if you meet people, and hopefully many people, then you realize there are good Turks, good French, bad French. In every nationality, there's a whole set of adjectives you can use for people, not just one single. But if you don't know, if you have no contact, then it's easier for people to swallow those narratives.
Yeah. And it also takes up time, because you have to explain your background on occasions, and I have to explain my background on occasions when other parliamentarians don't have to. And I'm thinking, I could have spent this time talking about what I'm trying to achieve and what I stand for, but your obsession is what are my experiences, my heritage and my faith, and how I've ended up being a member of parliament. And it just takes away that time where you could connect with somebody. But when you're always perceived as the other, you always have to give up a few moments to justify why you're here. So have you got a trick to getting that right? Or are you still evolving it?
I think it's an ongoing journey, you know, and we have to fight for those nuances. We have to fight for that multiplicity, and we should never let go of that. And to me, when I hear your stories, I'm interested in those stories, and I know those stories can inspire me, can inspire someone else. So in a way, it's a blessing too, to be able to talk about our personal stories.
But unfortunately, when our personal stories don't match the people that ask us the question, they get disappointed because we don't share their anxiety, we don't share their idea of victimhood, or we're not going to be the kind of person they expected us to be.
Yeah.
Because they don't meet that many people that aren't in their own reflection.
True, and this is where I think I make a distinction between the elite and the people, because just to give you an example, when I follow the political discourse, I think it was a big mistake for Hillary Clinton, for instance, to call half of Trump's voters a basket of deplorables, right? You might be critical of Trump. In my opinion, we should be very critical of Trump and all populist demagogues, but to call everyone who has voted for him this way or that way, or I'm very critical of Brexit, but to call everyone who has voted for Brexit, to put everyone in the same basket. You see what I mean? To put one label on a majority of, on a community of people, to me this is a very, very wrong approach. And this is where we need stories. This is where we need emotional intelligence. And this is where we need empathy. I should be very critical of the populist demagogues at top, but at the same time connect with the people, see what their feelings are, and share my own feelings with theirs, and exchange those stories. It is our responsibility to go beyond our own echo chambers, our own comfort zones. And I think this is going to be one of the biggest challenges. Again, in a country like Turkey, I have seen when countries are polarized bitterly, the system, the collapse becomes faster. When you lose the culture of coexistence, when you stop exchanging words, the only people who benefit from this are the demagogues at top. It's not a coincidence that every demagogue wants to sow this duality of us versus them. And if we repeat the same mistake, you know, it's just playing into their hands. So to me, it's very important to be able to talk with people who are completely different, who have a very different worldview.
You've already covered a number of taboo issues within your writing, and I, as a politician, try and do my best to find those stories that aren't often highlighted. I did some work with Bernardo's on child sexual exploitation when the perpetrators were children themselves, trying to raise the conversation about extremism, trying to talk about the families' experiences who are left behind when their children become extremists and travel overseas. I wondered what taboo subjects you feel that you are not yet ready to tackle, even too big for you.
That's a tough question. There isn't one single subject that I feel like I haven't tackled yet. I gave a TED talk recently in New York. That was a very difficult one for me to deliver because it was a very personal story as well. So maybe that was challenging. But I think in my novels, depending on the story, again, because I want to tell the story through the eyes of others, I almost instinctively move in that direction and just ask these questions and just to create an open space in which different opinions can be heard. That has always been my instinct. There isn't one particular issue that I think, no, I'm deliberately avoiding, but I also know that it's not easy to write about sexual taboos. It's not easy to talk about political taboos. You know, you pay little prices and you still keep doing it. So it's not an easy journey. I'm very much aware of that.
Why was your TED talk difficult?
Because I talked about my own sexuality. I talked about bisexuality in that particular TED talk, and I also talked about it was like a multiplicity, a manifesto for multiplicity, and the reaction afterwards from Turkey was incredibly bitter, and you know, the slander, the attacks, the hate speech. What was going on social media, but also in the media, written culture, TV channels, and it went on for quite a long time, for about 3 weeks. It was quite exhausting, and you realize maybe that social media is a bit like the moon. You know, it has a bright side, and I by no means underestimate that bright side, because I think it does connect us. It is much more egalitarian, and I've seen many women, especially in the region in the Middle East, who feel like their voices have been pushed back in the public space towards the private space. But then in social media, when I look at users, Facebook users, Twitter users, so many of them are young women, and they feel like they're carving out another public space for themselves in that digital world. So that is something I never underestimate. But there's also a dark side to it. And that is slander, that is hate speech, that is how easily and quickly hate speech can travel or misinformation can travel. And I think we all need to be very careful about that and very vigilant of that, you know, the amount of misinformation that is being circulated at this moment.
But you can never control it, isn't there?
We can never control it, but we can be more aware as citizens, and we must, because it's changing the entire political landscape across the world.
And as you become a public person, people want you to give up more of yourself, the same for people in politics, but the more you give up of yourself, the more that information is then misconstrued or abuse begins, and it's quite hard to manage. We talked earlier on about how we try and manage the abuse of parliamentarians. We spoke about my colleague who was killed about a year ago, Joe Cox, and how we try and say we want more women in politics, we want more women engaging in political discourse, because you don't really want to share the other side, which is it's going to at times become incredibly difficult just because you are a woman.
Yeah.
And we've collected evidence to show that, of course, men get abused too, but overwhelmingly it's women. And it is then triggers more if you're of Jewish or Islamic faith, and it triggers more if you are a migrant or of colour.
Yeah.
And I would have hoped that once your world was opened up with social media and access to the internet and the phones, what I didn't have growing up, that people would be more open instead of becoming more closed and abusing each other a lot more instead of trying to explore what the other person was.
Yeah. I fully agree, and I'm very much aware that for women it's much more harder. For women of minority backgrounds, definitely harder. And I think what the social media are doing to our conscience is oftentimes people don't realize that words can hurt. You know, they write the way they would never talk in their daily life. They say things they write things that they would never express in their daily life when you have a face-to-face conversation, eye-to-eye conversation. To me, that's so interesting. You know, that lack of conscience that it creates, and so dangerous at the same time. But definitely, when it comes to women, insulting women, ridiculing women, I mean, what's going on there is that I wouldn't even compare it. And again, that's one more reason why we need these support networks.
But there are still women getting ahead. You are here today, and we're going to take questions from the floor, hopefully from men and women. But before we take the first question, this is one of your quotes. The words that come out of our mouths do not vanish, but are perpetually stored in infinite space, and they will come back to us in due time. Is there something that you said that you wished you hadn't said or written, and it's come back to bite you?
Not really. I think you realize it's quite paradoxical. When you're a journalist in Turkey, a writer, a poet, you realize words are heavy. Words can put you in trouble. Just because of a tweet or a retweet, a poem, you can be sued, you can be arrested, you can be exiled. So on the one hand, maybe there's this mechanism of self-censorship that wants to work. But at the same time, there's another part of you that trusts words, that believes in words. And ironically, I think in countries like Turkey, words matter. You realize stories matter. But even in countries where there is very little freedom of speech, that word of mouth, how people share a book. In Turkey, a book is not only a personal item. You just don't read it and then put it on a shelf. You read it, and if you like it, you pass it on. You give it to your best friend. You share it to your aunt. I have seen so many books that have been underlined by different colored pens or pencils because different people have read the same book. So I think in Turkey, in Pakistan, in India, maybe the same copy is read by 6-7 people on average. To me, that is incredibly precious. So I think it's the readers who keep that, the art of storytelling alive, and who show us that words matter, stories matter, even when stories and words are regarded as dangerous because of the political situation.
Fair enough. Unfortunately, everything I say in Parliament is written down in Hansard. I don't think anyone signs it or shares it. But we're going to take some questions from the floor. If you will raise your hands, we'll go round. And we'll go.
Hi Elif, my name is Adila. It was really interesting to hear your talk. You spoke a lot about politics. It'd be good to know more about your books and what your favourite book is, and whether you have a process for your writing. So if you have to be in a particular room, if you have to work on a laptop, you know, how many words you get through a day would be quite interesting to know.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. I know some writers are very proud of their precise schedules, like they start every day at 8 o'clock, you know, until 11 they work, and then they go out for a walk. But I think for many women writers, especially those with young children, it doesn't work like that. And you have to carve out a space, day or night. Every day is a different day, but every day you have to write. Every day you have to read. It doesn't mean that everything you write you keep or put it in a novel, but there has to be a continuity, you know? That is my discipline, but it could be daytime or nighttime. It's different. The only thing I can tell you is I don't like silence, and I find silence very intimidating. So when I write, I like to be surrounded by noise. Maybe this is the impact of Istanbul, because I used to live in a very, very noisy place in Istanbul. It was called the Street of Cauldron Makers. It was much more noisy at night time than during the day. So I became very used to this, and when I write, I put on headphones. I like to listen to music, and I like to listen to very harsh, loud music, usually different types of heavy metal. I listen. And I listen to the same song on, you know, like loop, like 80 times, 70 times, and you enter into this circle. That helps me to concentrate. That's how I write, but with every writer it's different.
Elif, can I ask, Black Milk was written after, was it your first or your second?
Yes, the first.
First, and you had some issues after you had
Yeah.
your, was it postnatal depression?
It was,
so how long did it take you to write that book?
It was postpartum depression, and it left a big impact on me, actually, because, you know, I've been writing since I was 8 years old, and I always thought, I just need a pen and the paper and my imagination, just you take it for granted. That was for the first time in my life I couldn't write anything, as if words had been taken from me. And then you have to look within. Depressions are, in the long run, they're like golden opportunities, because normally you're constantly rushing, you don't have to look at yourself, you don't have to reconstruct yourself, and you don't have time for that. But when you fall down and all your pieces are scattered, you have to sit down and reassemble yourself. And that was when I realized, maybe, because I always talk about democracy as an outside thing, but then I realized I also need democracy inside. I had these different voices inside of me, and the part of me that was much more maybe maternal, more domestic, I had always belittled that side. For me, it was very important to be in the world of books, intellectual. You know, she was my queen. There was a hierarchy inside me and no democracy. So when you are depressed, you collapse. There's pure anarchy. But hopefully at the end you go through all those seasons, maybe an inner democracy, and it taught me a lot, the postpartum depression, and I think we need to talk about it because it's yet another taboo, especially in countries like Turkey. People think, you know, the moment you have a child, you become a mother or a parent. It's not like that. It's an ongoing process. You learn. Everything is based on learning. You know, love, parenthood, everything in life. And there can be bumpy roads from time to time. There can be emotional turbulence. We need to be able to talk about these things too.
Fair enough. With a lady in a red jumper, I think, had a hand up earlier.
Merhaba.
Merhaba.
I was wondering, do you have any advice for people who are from two places, two different countries, or who maybe live somewhere other than where they're born? Any advice? Because I know that sometimes, for example, I'm half Turkish, I really miss Turkey a lot, but I live here, and sometimes I find it really hard to juggle, and I think that maybe a lot of people do.
Yes, I hear what you're saying, and I think lots of people feel the same way, and maybe it's a bit difficult when you're younger, and there are expectations on both sides. It is as if you don't conform, but at the same time, this richness that you have, you know, I think this is the age in which more and more people dream in more than one language. It happens. The mind recognizes no boundaries. Sometimes you start a dream in English, you finish it in Spanish. You know, there are no national boundaries. If we can do that while we're dreaming, we can do it in our daily lives. We can write in more than one language, you know, speak, express ourselves. We can be more than one. We don't have to choose. It's not an either or choice. Why not be both and be more than that? And I'm concerned because I think tribalists on both sides are telling us, which one are you? You know, are you a Muslim? Are you Turkish? Are you this? Are you that? Prove it and just stay in that cocoon. We don't have to follow that path.
Do you want to go? There's a chap there.
Hi,
Hi.
my name is Wahid. I'm from Pakistan. So you talked about identity politics and how you think that there should be more fluidity in identity. But then you also talked about how there should be separate quota for women, and you also talked about how there should be more women in order to, bring forward more, the women empowerment, as we say. But don't you think that that is in itself creating a different form of identity, and it's kind of excluding men out of that certain kind of movement that we want to do? How can we evaporate that identity in itself and include more men in this movement of bringing forward more women?
Yeah. I thank you, and I think your question is so important. And it's one of the things that feminist movements throughout the generations maybe have neglected. We need to go beyond our comfort zones as well. To me, it's very important that feminism works hand in hand with LGBT movement and is supportive mutually, but it is also beyond that. How to bring more and more men into the conversation rather than shutting the doors. The way I see it, I'm not questioning men, I'm questioning a certain form of masculinity that is being imposed on us. And when you see it that way, I think in patriarchal societies, it's very clear that women are unhappy, but I believe men are also unhappy, particularly for young men who do not conform to that given description of masculinity for whichever reason, because they're creative, because they have their own individuality, this reason or that reason. For them, life is very, very hard. And sometimes we women make their lives very hard because of the way we raise our sons, like you touched upon. We raise our sons like the sultans in the family, yeah? And we teach them that they have a right to keep an eye on the modesty of their sisters, of their female relatives. If they don't conform, we ridicule them, the mockery, right? Or the way we isolate. So I am very much aware that together we need to question masculinity, and it's something we can achieve only if we unite forces. So I thank you. I do believe that we need to bring more men into the conversation.
Do you then deliberately, when you are putting your novels together, have to focus on your male characters to make sure they're not excluded? Because as a feminist, you probably have your female stories already. Or do your stories come first and the characters come second?
I've been criticized for this. They have told me, and I thought about this, that there are more strong, feisty female characters in my books than male characters. Maybe it's because I grew up observing these women through my grandmother and many other women. This is how I was raised. But after becoming a mother of a son, you realize, how is masculinity constructed? It taught me a lot, and I wrote Honor after my son was born. And Honor is a book that very much questions mother-son relationship, how we raise our sons. Like this, again, just an example, but in Turkey and elsewhere, of course, it's a huge thing, the circumcision rituals. When boys show their emotions, it's usually the mother who scolds and tells him not to cry and to behave like a man and to man up. We need to be critical of ourselves as well and how we internalize masculinity and the codes of masculinity.
Hi Elif, my name is Bashak. I'm a writer as well. I just wanted to ask you something a little more literary, I guess. Where do the words come from for you? And what do they mean after all these years? I mean, you've had so many novels. Does it still have the same effect on you, or has it changed over time?
Thank you. It's such a beautiful question. I think I've never seen words language as an instrument, as something that I use and then put aside. To me, it's more like a space I enter into. I inhale it. And I believe languages shape us. They shape the way we talk. They even shape the intonation, our voice. Do you realize when you move from one language, switch languages, the way we speak changes, our body language changes. And I don't think that's a coincidence. I feel attached to both the English and the Turkish language in different ways. And of course, Turkish to me is very emotional. It's the language of my grandmother, yeah. But even when I was only writing in Turkish early on, I was very much questioning daily life Turkish. For those people in the audience who might not be familiar with this, in Turkey we have Turkified our language. This was a language, because it was a multi-ethnic empire, the syntax of the Ottoman language was Turkish, but the vocabulary came from everywhere. From Persian, from Arabic, we have so many words from Arabic and Persian, but also from Ladino, from Armenian, from Greek, yeah? So all of those words have been taken out. And in Turkish today, I can say yellow, and I can say red, but the shades in between are gone. I don't have words for that. And there's a part of me that laments that loss. So when I was writing only in Turkish, I was also using, and I still do, I was using lots of old words together with new words. In Turkey, this is a big political debate. If you're a leftist, if you're a liberal, you're not supposed to use those words. So people were confused. Why is she using those old words? To me, there's no such thing. You know, words live longer than us. So I think you pay attention to vocabulary, to those nuances that are gone. And also when you switch, when you commute between languages, you start to pay attention to those words that cannot be translated immediately from one language to another. And you start asking yourself, why is it like that? Yeah? It tells you so much about the culture. But I gave this example earlier in a talk. I've seen many women, Turkish women, middle class, upper class, you know, brought up in a certain way. They can never swear in Turkish. And I listen to them, they swear in English, left and right. And I'm like looking at these women, is it the same person? Something shifts in our even psychology. Sometimes we prefer to express our anger in a different language. To me, it's very interesting to see parents who speak in a different language next to their children when they're speaking about something private. I've met many Armenian American families who speak Turkish next to their children when they're expressing, even though they can no longer live in Turkey. So I'm fascinated by the journeys of words and the loss, the absences that they also hide.
I think we'll take a question from the other room.
Hello, my name is Iqbal. I'm from Tunisia. Actually, I read your book, The Three Daughters of Eve, lately. And it was kind of a revelation for me because I had kind of very mixed background in terms of my paternal family was very Sunni and my maternal family is very Shia. And I had this, it struck me from very early age how different narratives can be and how uncertainties can be very contradictory within the same religion. And then I had this idea always to how can we change the religion from very uncertain thing to very certain thing to kind of an uncertain and a flexible thing. And then the message I got from your book was that instead of changing the religion itself, maybe we can focus on changing how we think about God and what He can do and what are His values and then and the scope of His strength. Because I remember when there is a passage in your book about what, like a lot of people wanted to change the world and then Perry wanted to change God. And I was wondering, is that actually the message that you wanted to communicate through the book?
Thank you so much. Thank you. I also thank you for sharing with us, you know, your own personal journey. I think it's so important to hear your voice. For many reasons, we tend to think that the Islamic world is very monolithic, as if there's only one voice. There's no such thing. It's a plurality of voices. And I think particularly women, young women, are asking lots of crucial questions because it affects them more. When countries go backwards, when they tumble into nationalism, extremism, or populism, women have much more to lose in terms of their day-to-day liberties. And many young women are talking about these issues, but the problem is, we're talking about these questions in our homes, or between friends, over coffee or lunch. We don't bring those debates into the public space, but we must, because then your voice gives me courage, and maybe my voice gives someone else courage. We need to hear these voices, and as you said, even within the same religion, there are so many different interpretations. So there's no point in talking about absolute certainties. Yeah, I have to understand, I have to have that cognitive flexibility. And this is why I think what Sufism was talking about was so precious, because the Sufis used to say there are as many paths leading to God as the number of hearts beating for Him. There was always this emphasis on plurality that again we have lost in the region today, but we have to restore through stories.
I think we've got time for one more question.
There was someone at the extreme left, had their hand up for a while, the lady there with the glasses, I think.
Hello, I just want to thank you for a great conversation. And there was a question to both of you, and I've had to reformulate it after this wonderful question from the woman just in front of me about language. Yeah. Because my question was to both of you, and it was about secular values as a protection for the voice of writers and for the voice of dissent. And by secular values, I want to explain that I'm British, and I campaign for the disestablishment of the church, because I think there's a huge influence of Christianity in public dispensation. But I am also from India and campaigning against Hindutva, a very right-wing Hindu government. And the secular values that I'm talking about are precisely protective of religious values that don't interfere with rights, which protect the right to be LGBT. You know, there's been major Supreme Court decisions against what the government is trying to do in many cases, protecting dissent and protecting LGBT rights. And so what do you think about secular values here in Britain, which is a Christian established state, which has allowed massive sexual abuse via the church, for instance, and also in other parts of the world against demagoguery and the other things, identity politics that you were talking about?
Well, I would say that in my experience, the people that I meet either in the constituency or up and down the country wouldn't identify by their faith. There are fewer and fewer people going to what we see as traditional churches, even though there are other faiths that might be booming. And that has to sit very neatly to people's equality and their right to live the lives that they choose to live. And we've talked about faith a lot today because Elif and I share the history of being raised as Muslims. That gives us some particular experience. But we have to accept people that do have faith and are quite conservative in their faith and respect that as well. We're also ensure that people that choose not to have a faith, choose to leave a faith, adopt another faith, or don't want to have their rights denied because of an institution that might be faith-based, that has to be respected too. It does worry me that people who choose to identify with their faith first may not understand the polarity within their faith. Only their voice is then heard. But I don't think in the UK, because you mentioned the India decision on LGBT and the history there, I don't think it's the same here. I'm not sure what you feel considering you're coming and going from Turkey.
No, well, again, in the Three Daughters of Eve, I couldn't help comparing Oxford and Istanbul. To me, it's interesting how universities, which were more religious spaces in the past, have become secular over the centuries. We couldn't have that kind of transformation in many parts of the Muslim world. I question that. To me, secularism is very important, but I want to explore the concept because it can mean different things. In France, laïcité has a different form. In Turkey, laïcité took a different form. But the core secular values, I think for women in particular, and for minorities, but for everyone, to me it's very important to have that individual liberty, not to intrude on other people's faith and impose your own interpretation on other people, to allow those diversity of voices that we have been talking about to come to the fore, to the public space. For that to happen, we need secularism, we need those secular values, but at the same time we need diversity. Because if you don't have that and everybody is in their own tribes, we don't really hear what the other is going through. And the irony is oftentimes it's easier for people, for orthodox-minded people of different faiths, to respect each other then to respect the different opinions and interpretations within their communities. You know, that's where they get intolerant. You see what I mean? And it was the same thing throughout history. So to diversify the dialogue, not among faiths, but within, to me, is much more important.
I think you and I have our own battles as feminists and Muslims to deal with on a day-to-day basis. I think that was the last question, if I'm...
Yeah, thank you so much, Nus Ghani and Elif Shafak. Thank you.
Thank you.